Why is shame such a powerful emotion? How does it affect us mentally, physically, emotionally? I'm Nadia Davis. I'm a mom, author, attorney, and Kundalini yoga teacher who has experienced public shaming that brought me to my knees. On this podcast, I'm going to tell you how I'm living the work, taking shame out of the shadows. I'll give you real life advice and skills to take away with you throughout your day. You'll hear from powerful guests who have overcome trauma and emerged stronger than ever. You too can ban the shame within and around you. Join me. You are not alone. Welcome home, everybody. Welcome to a place that is safe and judgment-free and where we work to build a home within us. And I call it home because it's a place where I can recognize when my mind is creating thoughts that are separating me from my true self and others. And I can recognize when there are fear and judgment-based thoughts before they turn into shame. And shame, I despise so much because I feel like it separates us from each other. And today, I am interviewing somebody that I believe is a leader in dragging shame out of the shadows and really, really helping people to put words on the feelings that are shame and that manifest into shame. And I had the honor of being interviewed by Dr. Elizabeth Cronin, my guest today, sometime back. And she is a host for the New Books Network, where she interviews authors for the Psychology channel, as well as the Spiritual Practice and Mindfulness channels. And please check her out. The links are in this description. And I clearly remember when you interviewed me and how safe I felt to dive into the story and to really share from my heart from a place of vulnerability. And I think that that's key. Dr. Marissa Franco talks about how what we feel vulnerable about is what we have learned to feel shame about or in ourselves. And when we talked, I was in shame, yet aware of it, and then able to transform it into power, which is what we're going to do here on this podcast, by having that safe place. And so that is right up the alley of what Dr. Elizabeth Cronin does. And it is such an honor to have you here today. And I so need to pick your brain about being a new podcast host and all the ways that you walked through it. And just thank you so much for being here today. And please, where did it all begin?
So thanks for having me. I guess it all begins where life begins, just, in your childhood and, um, developing, and over the years that you develop, sort of becoming known as having certain gifts or talents or challenges. And I was always a very sensitive child. So that came with, for me, that was some of my early experiences of really feeling shame, experiencing shame, is just being very emotional, and people thinking it was too much, and so then feeling like, okay, you're
Yeah, say more. Dive in there more. Like
just that,
how
the reaction to something is too much, too intense, too loud, too
you heard that.
prolonged. Yes. Oh, yes. And in reality, if I had been my own parent to myself, then I probably would have agreed too, because this was all before I went on to become really interested in psychology and really learned and had a deeper understanding about emotions and how to help someone with very intense emotions.
Okay.
So I work with a lot of parents in therapy, trying to help them understand too how to kind of break the cycle of
Mhm.
perpetuating shame by looking at emotions in a with a deeper understanding and a little bit more respect,
Mhm.
which I think is super important because as you were saying, as soon as you get into shame, you're talking about feeling so awful about yourself that you don't want to share anything. So you really just want to hide. You don't want to, and so from a place of shame too, you can be so distraught, and someone might ask you what's going on, and you don't even want to open open up and explain because you've already decided that to share that with anybody else is only going to cause them to even distance further from you.
Right, that fear. Did you have to and did you go back, to that little girl? Because we always hear, "Forget the past, get over it, move on," and whatever, but she's there in us, and I mean, what I learned the hard way is to listen to her, and we call them parts that are in us, but did you and do that, and what did that feel like? And what were the kind of words that you would put on that that label? I'm sensitive, you know,
Mhm.
can you dive in there?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of my kids, I have three biological children, and one of my youngest actually recently asked me if I had ever taken the highly sensitive person quiz, and I said no. I actually haven't, and she had recently taken it, and she and her good friend had taken it, and just had a
The
lot of questions
highly
like
sensitive
highly
it
sensitive person. There's a little quiz, you can Google it and you'll find
okay.
it online. And it just has a series of questions, and it just things like, talks about how intensely you feel things, but it also said how you have like a very vivid imagination and very active internal life, thinking about things and startling easily. It had all these things, and she was funny because she was like, I'm answering these things and thinking yes, 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 and she's thinking, oh my gosh, this is my mother, this is my mother, this is my mother. So she was telling me about it. And the other thing that she said too is she said, as her friend was doing, because her friend's also very sensitive, they were laughing, they were saying, isn't everybody like this,
Right?
just a sense of like, you have that sense that isn't everybody like this, unless in being like that it's been a problem, it's irritated other people, or it's frustrated other people, um, or it's excluded you from something.
Yeah, and that's where, like, it's this pivotal point of, um, taking on the label and what it's doing within somebody, especially a child, and what it did to you, versus having, like you, a parent who can say, well, let's flip that understanding, because being quote unquote sensitive means, you're in tuned to others' feelings and energies around you, and um so so what is it like what was it like for you? Like, how did it feel to be labeled, quote, unquote, "sensitive"? And then how is that helpful while you're navigating the waters of your little one finding this label on themselves? What was it like for you?
Right. So that's kind of what I, was interesting for me, is that, she's actually not so little anymore. She's a graduate student studying psychology now, and so she's not little. And yet, I think the whole idea that maybe she was a highly sensitive person was a novel idea to her. I think she
Okay.
had more of experience that this is kind of the way I am. I think a little less judgment. Um, no, I mean,
How cool that she's following in your footsteps.
Yeah, I know, it's really
Yeah.
it's so exciting. So I was one of 7 children too. So, it's definitely it's not easy if you have a child who takes a long time to get to recover from things, who's very gets has deep emotions and then takes a long time to bounce back. So I really have a lot of I actually have a lot of empathy for parents that have children like that, because it's more time consuming and complicated. But it's really hard. It was very hard for me as a child, because that was the first sense that I had that there's something wrong with me and something bad about me. And I've done tons of therapy, which I mean,
Even though there was so much going on around you as the youngest of 7,
well, it wasn't the youngest, I was the third.
or okay.
But just being part, I mean, we were all like, it was an 11-year span. So it was just boom,
Mhm.
boom, 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 boom. And I have 2 brothers that were born 11 months apart. And there's just a lot going on. And so it's not easy to have somebody who needs more comforting, somebody who needs a little bit more support. It just isn't easy. And so I think that meant then that there were times that I really was alone with a lot of my emotions and feelings, and
Right.
that fuels the fear too. So you might be
So
feeling
if
some sort
it's
of shame, and then you feel separate from people, and then sometimes it's too much for other people, and so it just fuels the sense of fear
so
around.
like a sense of not did you have the sense though of so not being seen, not having the eye contact with somebody saying what's really going on in there?
Right.
And then would that have quelled the
Yes.
sensitivity or the whatever thoughts were going in your head? What created the on the outside, what created the sense of isolation? And then on the inside, we know it was the thoughts. So on the outside, what was creating that sense? A lot of people and what else?
Well, so I'll give you, I can give you a sort of a benign example. It's
Okay.
not, it's that, so I was one of 7 kids, and my 2 older sisters were up early one morning before a ski trip, and one of them was leaning against the gas stove. And so her nightgown caught on fire, and she was in a total panic and starts yelling, fire, fire, and running around. And my older sister is chasing her and put the fire out with pillows, and it was all fine. But in the whole chaos of all of this, I'd been sleeping, and I wake up and I hear fire, and I have this big reaction like, oh my gosh, there's a fire and everything. And
Mhm.
I just jumped into like the school protocol for a fire drill. So I
Uh-huh.
just go down the hall. I get my younger siblings. So I get like the baby out of the crib and the 2 toddlers and my younger sister, and marched them all outside, across the street, and we're all made them stand in. I did exactly what we did at school: turn and face the building, wait for the fire trucks to come. And my older sister, about probably we were out there probably like 5 or 6 minutes.
That's cool.
I know, it's really funny. So, I mean, this shows you how effective those trainings are. But so we're out there about 5 minutes or so. And at some point, I guess the fire was out. My parents, meanwhile, had been running around trying to find out what's going on. And then my older sister, I'm sure my parents were attending to my sister who been burnt just slightly, but she
Oh,
came
it
out and
was
said,
actually
"Oh,
in
there
the
was there was a fire in
oh
her."
my.
Yeah, there was a fire on her nightgown. So but my sister put it out. But so my point is that I just sort of had this big reaction, and I go outside, and in a way, like I was creating more drama for my family and everything, not intentionally, because my older sister comes out and she's like, "What are you doing out here?" Just I had a lot of shame about that. Like what are
Wow.
you doing out here? And I just remember feeling, for I think you have a sense of like embarrassment, like it's embarrassing that I did this. But then I felt, then the overlay is sort of the shame around what's wrong with you, kind of like why do you do things like this. I mean, certain things are embarrassing, but it's when it goes to the deeper level of like, okay, that's beyond what people do. It's sort of, that's the point. It's sort of like what's wrong with you feeling.
But the truth, the underlying truth that none of the shame thoughts or whatever anybody was saying, that what was the underlying truth in those moments that you did that?
Oh, my intention was just be protective of myself,
Exactly.
and
Exactly. And
right,
that gets muddled underneath how the mind was creating these self-judgments and then
right,
the judgments from the others, because the underlying truth is beautiful.
right, 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 right. I mean, so that's why I'm saying it's kind of it's a story
Hmm.
I can share easily because there's nothing there's it's just it kind of shows how shame develops without anybody intending any harm to
Right.
anybody, which I think happens a lot. And I work a lot with parents with kids that are challenging, and often the parents just feel like, what, oh, why is this child like this? And I try to guide them over and over again to say, whatever it is that they're doing that's either upsetting or offensive or problematic, you need to realize that that's the best that they can do. That so get on their side and try to help show them what else they could do, because the
Right.
alternative is to convey to them the frustration or the that you feel. And so shame's a tough thing to battle, because um, I also think that if there's shame around having there's shame around other people's behavior. So for example, if you take like parenting, or you take being in a relationship with someone with an addiction, there's also sort of a shame around, like, in a sense of responsibility for somebody else's behavior.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think sometimes people retaliate and say, like, you should be ashamed of yourself, as a way
Mhm.
to try to, like, coax somebody into, like, not acting that way.
Mm. Won't
Yeah,
work.
no.
Won't work. And what you said was beautiful, though, about, um I mean, it relates to being present as a parent, and, acknowledging what's happening, what they're feeling in the moment,
Right.
right? And if someone kind of had done that for you and seen the underlying truth, then that and verbalize, "Well, she was just trying to keep us safe," or "Thank you for trying, that was funny," that you did that. Um, would that have helped to create then the story that the mind attaches onto, and feeds it more and more and more, like, "Why am I so weird? Why did I do the drill?" And whatever else came up that then how affected you emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, probably. And so when you were carrying that label of "I'm sensitive,"
Hmm.
and those shame feelings, like, how did they manifest? You said, emotionally, um, it was this catch-22. It made you even probably more self-conscious?
Definitely made me more self-conscious. And so, over the years, I think what happened was, it just took it felt like a heavier burden on me, that I was definitely made a big deal out of things. And, I took up too much time, and my emotions took too much space. And the way it ended up manifesting for me was, by the time I was 14, I was, struggling with an eating disorder, and
Mm,
I was anorexic. And, I don't you know, didn't intend to shrink myself, but in
right.
my understanding and therapy and coming to terms with all of that, I, definitely didn't feel prepared to go out into the adult world, because
Mhm.
I didn't. So to make my body more childlike, there were just so
Mm,
many ways that becoming anorexic made sense to me, even though I didn't consciously wasn't trying to do those things. I made myself smaller. I made myself more childlike. I made my world smaller. I gave myself a sense of control over myself
mhm.
by controlling what I ate.
So they were like these core beliefs. I mean, what would you say were the core grounding beliefs that then your mind kept creating different thoughts and fears based on? So, I mean, what I'm hearing you say, the core beliefs from childhood were, um, I am a nuisance, or I'm a sense of unworthiness. And but what else? In the first couple of episodes, I do an overview of the book and the story, and it's really focused on beginning with recognizing those core beliefs from childhood that our mind latches onto today.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of a first step of awareness of how our mind will try to create shame, but if we're aware of those fears and judgments. So what do you think yours are
Mhm.
based on what we just
I
discussed?
think I definitely felt like, had that sense that there was something different and wrong with me, and that I needed to hide that.
So
I
there's
need
something inherently wrong that can't be
something,
fixed.
yeah, something inherently wrong. So there
Okay.
was something about, I think different than feeling guilty or
Right.
embarrassed. I think shame is really a sense of like I'm a bad seed or something. Like there's just so it's me.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
not something I've done or anything. It's just me, the way I am, the way I was too much, was somehow wrong, and that
Wow.
I needed to work hard. And you ask about what's a song that
That's
you really
super
really like.
powerful. The way I am is wrong.
Mm. Yeah,
The
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 way I am.
be, it got to the presence, the being.
Right. And I want to say this, that I had a loving family and loving parents. I
Mhm.
think that's, important to put out there too, that there was, and because that also further complicated things for me too. Had I been less privileged and less well cared for, then maybe I would have, but that also made it very confusing too. That I was at times deeply unhappy, and there didn't seem to be any apparent reason. And I grew
So
up in
the guilt
a
and the
yes.
shame. Okay.
So right. So
Good. Okay.
yes, guilt. And I grew up in a family where we believed in working hard and not feeling sorry for yourself, and just recognizing
Mm.
that you were, being very grateful for what you had, and knowing that people struggled and had a lot less than you. And we were always we were, members of a church, and so it was very, very, very confusing. And and people, we just didn't understand. So it was tough. I mean, it was really tough. I remember getting to college and thinking, oh my gosh, I never want to go back. Like I would never go back to being a kid again. I had just,
Wow.
I remember distinctly thinking that, like, wow, I'm glad I got here. I made it. Because when I went to college, it was the first time I felt like, wow, there's a lot of tolerance. I got to college,
Mhm.
it was like, I met all kinds of people that are doing things that, we would have thought was sort of crazy, or
Mhm.
definitely questionable.
Mhm.
And yet they were fine. They were
Well,
fine
this is
doing it.
fascinating because you talked about, like, nothing on the outside creating it, but your mind created this, "There's something inherently wrong with me," that
Right.
core belief, and then, from the outside, so that's your own shame within, and then on the outside, this gratitude, focus, and good family, church-going family, that's the outside kind of sources of quote unquote shame. We don't have to force this, but just the outside sources of your guilt. And so you have that big picture, but then when you went to college, you saw other people more on the outside that also had, or was it, the college activities, or was it that they too shared their problems or had problems, or there was kind of less of a perfectionist thing around you that was with your family? Was that
Right.
it?
Right. That was it. And
Okay.
so it was yes, it was very, very life changing to realize that there was a lot more tolerance than what I thought
And
was possible.
tolerance for
Variety for a range of behaviors and feelings and
Mhm.
beliefs.
Okay. How do you think that that affected the core belief you had that there's something inherently wrong? Did it set in that, okay, well, maybe not everything is wrong with me?
So actually, I would say that in college, that what it did was it made me feel like, oh, there are alternative ways of being. And I think it really helped me realize maybe I could get help. So I all during my eating
Oh,
disorder,
that's interesting.
I didn't get any help. I was seen by the family pediatrician. They weighed me every week. This was back when I was in the Midwest in Illinois, and they actually really didn't know I was anorexic. It took them a while to figure that out, and they were doing all kinds of tests and ruling out all kinds of illnesses and things. And it,
How
I,
old were you?
14.
Okay, you said 14 now.
And actually, I remember another experience of deep shame. Actually,
Mm,
I'd forgotten about this, but I had gone and I'd been weighed. Um, and the doctor gave me an envelope to bring home to my mom. And I got in the car and I was with my sister. My older sister, Kathy, had taken me. She was supportive, very supportive during difficult times. And I got in the car and I said, "Oh, I'm supposed to give this to mom." And I was like, I'm going to open it up. And she was much more of a rebel. She was like, go ahead, open it. So I opened it up, and it was an article about anorexia that had been like in the New York Times or something that this doctor was sending home to my mom. This before there was email and all that stuff. And I
uh-huh.
remember I just read it and I just felt awful. I just felt a
Oh my
terrible shame. Like now there really is something wrong with me. That
Oh,
now
wow.
and they figured it out. They figured out what's wrong. I felt so exposed and um so that so and
So
again,
say more. Dive into that feeling, because it's kinda like, I mean, dive into that, the shame, because it was as though, "Oh, there's proof," and how your mind grasps onto that. There's proof something's inherently wrong. Like,
right,
what
right.
did
And
that
now
feel
there's
like?
something before it was just me and trying to make sure other people didn't find out this about me or couldn't see this about me. Just this sense that I knew I was
Mhm.
different, there was something wrong with me, but also this sense that but I could put on a performance, I could put on a mask, I could hide. And
I see.
now it was kind of like now there's a label.
Okay.
There's been a label attached to me. There's a name for at least one aspect of what's wrong with me.
So now
And
you're a sensitive anorexic.
yes, now, yes, yes, yes. And
Gosh,
yeah, yeah, it was a lot. It was a lot. And so,
and you
so
were
I'm saying,
14.
so again, had the family pediatrician, I mean, he was consulting with people trying to figure out, he had this young teenage girl. I mean, this was back in the, you know, late 70s. So,
Mhm.
I mean, it wasn't, this was before Karen Carpenter and, a lot of celebrity. I mean, they just didn't know. Um, if there had been a social worker or someone who understood, there would have been sensitivity to this. I to this day, I mean, I don't blame anyone. I'm not angry or bitter with anyone. It is just what I experienced, though. I mean, I just say that as as a deep wound that I experienced
It's the
as a
core
result of that.
wound. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay, so you have this, your mind's telling you, "Okay, there's this proof that of the the flaw, or that I am a flaw. And then you enter college, and with that core wound and belief,
Hmm.
then there's some more tolerance. Um,
Right.
how did that shift? So the outside, you're not around the family with the letter lingering in your parents' heads or your head, and the
Hmm.
label. But when you're in college, the tolerance, how did that start, or what did it start to kind of change within you? You said, like, maybe I'm not all wrong. Maybe what happened next?
I think it was just meeting people that were open and shared that they had been in trouble in high school, or um, like I can remember meeting really nice people who admitted that they had shoplifted at some point or something,
Uh-huh.
and thinking, oh wow, no, like I could never, if I had ever done that, that would be like the final straw.
It's so interesting, because here was someone that actually did something, quote unquote, wrong, but your situation wasn't wrong. You had a disease,
right, right.
but
The,
it helped.
it helped me because I think,
That's
again, part of the shame part for me is that just feeling so
acceptance.
different and
Okay.
feeling like I have to hide this about me, and exposure to people that were just very comfortable, like they knew that they had done things wrong or flawed, but they didn't see it as an indication that, I mean, they would
Or
talk
something
about
to
that
hide.
was the wrong thing I did. So it was me starting to see that there's something, starting to understand the shades of the feelings of what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and and knowing that there were people who were okay admitting they were just human, and
It's
that
like you had a safe place to, perhaps, or to be vulnerable. That's the thing, is that what we feel vulnerable about is what we
that's
have
right,
learned to
that's right.
feel or have shame about in ourselves.
Mhm.
So, did you end up feeling safe enough to dive into the vulnerability of reaching out for help with that, or sharing it with others? And how did
So I did. So
that's
that was,
transforming shame into
yeah,
power?
that was a turning point for me.
Okay.
So again, other people's willingness to be vulnerable
Mhm.
helped me see that maybe there were possibilities.
Okay.
And so I started to get interested, and I actually wrote to like an eating disorder organization. There were newsletters back then that you, and I wrote to them and said, "Is there someone who could help me?" And
Oh, wow. Do you
yeah,
realize how courageous that was?
I was pretty desperate. I was pretty desperate.
Wow.
When I say I was sensitive, I was really struggling with some depression, and I was having trouble with grades, like staying focused. It was just, in the end, I transferred. I was at the University of Illinois, and I transferred back to Boston College. So it's so complicated. It's a
But
complicated
you
story.
reached out while you're navigating this thing that is complicated to live with. I've
Mhm,
had some of the same struggles in the past around the same age,
mhm.
and we can talk more about that, but when you're in it, navigating it, and then you're aware, and then you reached out, because it's everyone assumes it's like you wanna be a skinny thing, and it has nothing to do with that. The fact that you reached out, um, was amazing. It's like one of the most courageous things that
It's,
you
yes,
can
and
do.
you know what? I think now it was actually courageous because I didn't have a lot of reason to have faith in professionals, given how they had treated, given the way.
Oh, interesting.
So it's interesting that I did, but I did, and my first experience was this like psychiatrist who was at locally in the area of the University of Illinois where I was a student, and you know what? My
And he was part of this newspaper?
He was just someone recommended as somebody I could go and see,
Okay.
which was kind of odd. But anyway, I ended up seeing him, and he ended up being a bad experience. He was like,
Oh,
first of all,
wow.
he suggested medication, and I was not interested in. Wait, I didn't trust him. I wasn't going to try that, and he just kept saying like, okay, like he pretty much was kind of like, what's wrong with you? Because
Oh my
he
God.
was like, you're smart. You've got all like he really did. I'm not kidding you. It was mind blowing. So I just I think I had gotten a number of different names of people. So I went to that person. And then at that point, this person who really helped me was a young graduate student who was at the University of Illinois, and she was studying anorexia. And she was like a nutritionist, but she was running a group for girls that, had eating
A grad
disorders.
student?
It was a grad student, and she got me into her group, and she met with me, and she was like, and that was huge to get into a group
Oh,
too, because when you realize like, wait a second, I didn't know that I wasn't this rare oddity too. So to find out there was a whole group of people at the university that we're all going to talk about our eating
what
disorders.
was that like walking in? And again, how courageous. You kept trying to figure it out. There was this instinct in you that this right then and there in those years. I mean, this isn't me, quote unquote. You didn't literally think this, but this isn't like my true self. This is something happening.
Right.
And you know what you know that grain of truth
Yeah.
while you reached out, and then the bad experience with the doctor, and then your reaching out again, like that was in you.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
then when you meet these other students,
Hmm.
what was that like?
I definitely knew, I definitely had that sense that there's something wrong with me, and I'm really not like that. I definitely had a sense that there was something about me that wasn't fully understood.
Okay,
That there
wait a
was
minute,
some
say that
essence.
again, because that's switching being in the shame to like this bridge. So it's separated from your core belief and core wound
Yeah.
where you are it, and then you're
Mhm.
getting this calling from this truth, your soul, and not the messages from your mind. And then you had a sense, say it again, that
So I
there
grew
was
up
something.
I grew up in a family that was Irish Catholic. So there's like language that we never would have even used that I can use now.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying really resonates with me. I had a sense that I had a soul, that there was like a spiritual being that was my essence, and that
Mm,
somehow the way my temperament or my personality, my humanness,
uh-huh.
was presenting in a way that people couldn't see, that there was something really good and pure, something that I could do, like there's like I could do. So that motivated my desire to get help, because I was really wanted to be a, a productive, helpful. I really wanted to be a helpful person. I mean, I
So you
wanted.
said your humanness or the presentation didn't reflect all of you or you.
Right,
Okay.
right. And
Yes.
I look back at that now, and I think because I needed more help developing certain skills,
Okay.
like impulse control and emotion regulation, and had I gotten that, I probably would have, developed just fine. And, you know, I think,
And
for
that's
example,
setting your mind in the right place. That's transforming the shame-based thoughts that you're like, "Okay, this is my humanness. I know this is really me. And so I'm gonna set my mind on the developmental part. I'm gonna switch the feelings of shame into" you said emotional regulation and what?
I was just
You s
thinking like impulse control.
Okay.
I think it really started. That's when I started to feel like, because I wasn't studying psychology in college even.
Mhm.
But that's when I started to realize, wait a second, I think I need to understand human behavior
Okay.
and human cognition. That's how I kind of got into the field of psychology, because I realized that there was a difference between who I thought I was at my essence
Okay.
and how I was navigating the world.
Okay. That's beautiful. That's a home.
Right.
That's a home within.
Right. I felt like there was a home within me and I couldn't get there.
Right.
I couldn't get there because I kept doing things or making decisions or thinking things.
So what happened thereafter? I mean, so you're an undergrad student and you get in this group, and what was the next kind of phase and step?
So I really I struggled. I struggled, and it took a long time. I ended up, after 2 years at the University of Illinois, I transferred. My family had moved to Illinois when I was in seventh grade, and then I had stayed, got through high school there. But when I got accepted to school, I was going to go to the University of Illinois to be close to home because my family was there. My dad took another job, and they moved back to Boston.
Okay.
That was very unfortunate because I felt very fragile. I was still really in the grip of an eating disorder, but I was going to go to college 2 hours away and felt like it was going to be helpful to be able to go home a lot. And they moved back to Boston.
Mhm.
So 2 years into it, I'm still struggling. My mom is very helpful in helping me transfer. And I transferred to Boston College, where I just felt safer being closer to my family of origin. Um, and then I just kept pursuing more. Then I got, actually in Boston, I got access to better therapists and people. Again, I used that same. It was called the National Eating Disorder Association. And
Mhm.
I asked them for resources, and I started to get good therapy and people that started to help me understand, and people that I started to say like all the stuff that I had done that I thought was so embarrassing and everything. And they were like, "Oh, well, but yes, you were 10," and it was
Different things that you had never kind of heard.
right. I mean, so, as a psychologist and in the profession, we would say sometimes what we'll do is someone will share something and they'll be so conflicted about it, and we call it normalizing, and we point out to them like, actually,
Mhm.
that's pretty normal. That's pretty much. And I had that experience over and over again, like really, because I thought that was me. So, again, that's one of the ways that um, through talking through and working through what felt shameful to me, I felt like, oh, you mean I do belong? Like I'm connected. I'm not different and separate. Like I started to get a sense of my belonging and my connection. I wasn't as foreign as I thought I was.
Right. This is so beautiful. It's really, a really great representation of the walking out of a life dictated by a survivalist mind.
Right. Right, right. And the interesting thing was during college, of course, you have lots of opportunities. I never, ever did try any drugs. I had that sense I was so fragile. I
Mhm.
had that sense and I was already, obsessive and compulsively dieting. I just, so and again, I think that's a part of, like, there was some soul spirit or something that
Mhm.
was guiding me. And so I had a sense that even as I struggled with all of this and felt very alone and disconnected, that there was some now, I mean,
So is that in retrospect, um, at on the time, or was there a conscious, like, sitting down, "I'm gonna meditate or pray," or were you going to church? Because there's a big difference between those 2. And, um, the the first one is there. It's this essence and calling that
Mhm.
is, like, always there. It's always there, and it may come up in, like, curiosity about the wave pattern,
Mhm.
or smiling back to a child smiling, and there's just something about it's a core innocence that we all have and come from. And what do you think, looking back, like, drove that? Like, was it growing up with the religion? What was, or it just was, you were calmer, or you're quieting your mind more? Because that is so key.
Yeah. It wasn't, the meditation stuff was not on my radar. So I think there
What would
were
you
parts
recommend? Yeah.
there were part of my Catholic upbringing that I think was soothing and comforting. When you hear certain things like, you know, Jesus forgiving everything, and there were a lot of
Mhm.
stories, but it was also a source of conflict too, because there was so much worry about judgment and all of that. So I think it was just a very mixed experience, but something about that, I just felt I always had some hope
Okay.
that, if I could just hang in there, there was there was something beyond all these deep and dark feelings.
So
It was,
compare that feeling, that state at the time, to then when you're buried in the core belief and wound as a child.
mhm, mhm.
Very different, right?
Oh, very, very, very different, very different. I
And
was
then
actually
yeah.
I've never read this book. It's been around forever. In fact, they had the 25th anniversary. It's called The Seed of the Soul.
Uh-huh.
And just listening to that, and he's talking about how, there are times when you just have real soul pain, just soul pain. It's that sense of just helplessness, hopelessness,
Mhm.
such disconnection. And I definitely, knew that kind of soul pain. And yet,
That's the spirit calling, though, right?
right, right. That's the sign. I think now I look back and I think now, like, when you feel that,
Mhm.
that's just how you know how disconnected you are from your essence when you're in that
Mhm.
level of pain.
And that's the point where there can be transformation. Sitting in a safe place of your own and listening,
Right,
just
right,
listening,
right,
starting with your breath,
right, right.
and you'll
That's
see
right.
there's a gem in it versus all the thoughts that come that say, "Why are you feeling this way? You're sensitive," you know, are controlling things, and not eating, forgetting to eat,
Yep,
um,
yep.
and okay, from there on out, how did you nurture that? How did you nurture that soul voice?
I think I had many, many years where I just needed to be nurtured. I really did find some good therapy. And
Good.
in particular, I had one therapist who I worked with for a very long time, and she had specialized in eating disorders, and she was willing to be a little bit more self-disclosing with me than,
Mhm,
other therapists that kind of had that stance of like, you're not going to know anything about me, which was made me very uncomfortable, because if you don't know anything about the other person, you don't see them as fully human either. They seem
mhm,
so perfect. And she was just a much more, I had actually found her because I had read something she'd written, and she'd written about treating girls with eating disorders. And, she'd written in this passage that one of her young patients had called her, and she wrote about how, like, okay, so she got her pillow and her blanket, and I could just, like, the fact that she was a real person. I thought, that's who I want to work with, somebody who's like a real person, not that's
okay.
going to be, not that is going to be like somebody I have
Not
to worry
talking
about.
to you, who was relatable and would
Right,
see you and you could connect
right.
with her.
And I just needed
Mm,
to be nurtured. I mean, I just did a lot of, like, just would show up, and I did a lot of crying, and I did a lot of like recounting
Mm.
difficult situations, and just that there was somebody who was interested and cared and didn't think I was, exaggerating and
Mhm.
blowing things out of proportion. That was so healing. That was so incredibly transformational.
And we all deserve a safe place to share, cry, and be vulnerable.
Hmm.
And if we can't find that place outside us, there is a place within us, and I call it home.
Yeah.
I want to continue with your story,
Mhm.
and so much. There's so much more to ask you and to share. And I really, really appreciate you opening up, because this is also a topic that isn't talked about a lot,
Right.
the underlying process of healing
Hmm.
from an issue with weight, I'll call it.
Hmm.
So thank you so much. Okay, so you're at this point of healing and having a safe place, being seen. And what was that feeling like when you felt seen? You felt like, oh, there's not something wrong. I'm not inherently flawed. And kind of lifting the layers of that core wound and belief.
So that's the part that I think is kind of confusing, because I actually that's how therapy works. And when I work with people, I try to explain this to them, that it isn't really clear. I didn't have a clear sense of like what was happening or whatever. It was experiential, right? So
Mhm.
something was shifting, and um and my therapist was amazing. However, something I added on to the kind of, she was like the primary model for me for how I am as a therapist. But something I've added on is I really try to say to people things like, you know, what I see has shifted in you, and give them specific examples, because I didn't have that sense. Definitely things had changed and shifted, but I wasn't that aware. And it wasn't until later on, when I went back to graduate school and I was studying psychology, that I started to have to do reflection papers for
Mm.
school, and I started to put the pieces together. So I was feeling a change, but I don't know that I would have had language for it.
No, the awareness wasn't there. You were in it.
Right. That's right.
What would you describe kind of the feelings in those in that phase? Was there like an anxiety? Was there like a sense of peace? Or it was all over the place, and so you kept doing more. You kept
I think there was just a
wanting more.
willingness. There was an increased ability to be vulnerable.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Over time. So what happened was, during that time period, I'd had journals from when I was in the throes of the really darkest days of my eating disorder, and I'd had some when I was still part of that organization, the eating disorder organization, and a researcher was doing something on that and asked if I'd be willing to share my journals. So I started doing
Wow.
that. Like, and
That was courageous.
I wrote a letter to a family friend that had had an so I started to share my story.
Mhm.
And remember, the terrible shame I had when I first saw this article that said, I mean, I wasn't going to say I had anorexia. I mean,
Wow.
I could not spit those words out of my mouth. And now I'd gotten to a place where it was a part of my story, not who I was.
Okay. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh my gosh, that gives me chills. That's beautiful. And so in the reflection back, the childhood pattern and then the experiencing part and then coming to a place of complete belief and understanding. It's you of your soul being the truth, and then how your mind had interpreted this challenge in life,
Mhm.
right? And then from that place, you went to, so that's where the choice between, and it is living the work today, right? Where
Oh,
where the thoughts will come up, and I always say they're most are fear and judgment based, and it's our mind survivalist in nature. But then we can choose love, and that navigating that space of being a spirit in a body that had these patterns or has them, but you're aware now.
right.
And then with your work, what happened then later, and where did you end up focusing your professional work?
So I started my professional work. Um, so when I was back in graduate school, I really at that point wanted to work with children because I really felt like it would have helped me as a child to have had someone who could have worked with me and guide me a little bit. I mean, I never saw a guidance counselor or anything like that in school. So I was really committed to trying to work with children and families, because if you work with children, it's families. So I did that. And I worked with kids in a school setting for a couple of years,
Oh,
and in the Boston public schools, kids who are at what would have been considered the behavioral school, who couldn't stay in the normal schools anymore. Boston has its own sort of outplacement schools
the
for kids like
sensitive
that.
kids. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, yeah, sensitive slash problematic kids, exactly. And
In the first episode, Dr. Cronin refers and goes over her childhood and a couple of things where she was called sensitive. Just an FYI to listen to the first podcast before this. So you were started working with those children,
yes,
and then you,
and just to
as
sort
a
of like,
psychologist.
as a psychologist, and I
Okay.
think it was my effort to. I think there were two things that were really continued. Like you said, it's a I'm still a work in progress. I'm still resolving old wounds and all of that. But two things that were really pivotal was being able to be a parent myself. So, and being able to just do things differently as a parent was a way of sort of like every time I did something different, I felt like I was doing it for the younger part of myself as well.
Oh,
And then
yes.
so that piece of it to parenting, but then also providing therapy to kids who are really having a hard time. That felt very cathartic
So you
too.
became a mother before, during the work with children?
Right. So I became a mom before I became a psychologist.
Wow. My gosh,
Mhm.
superwoman.
Yeah. Yeah. I had actually, like when I graduated from college, undergraduate, I'd been like a communications major. So I got into like public relations, then I did human resource management. So I had been doing things sort of around how the how human beings communicate and
Mhm,
interact and relate to each other, but I hadn't gotten into like psychology per
mhm.
se. So I had worked in human resources until I had my first child. And then I went back to graduate school when he was 3 months old. Um, and I got a master's in uh, human development and psychology. And I took a research job on a childcare study. Then I went on and had two more kids, and I did some part-time stuff, but I hadn't really continued. I just got my master's, and so then
Mhm.
it was like 12 years later that I went back to get a doctoral degree.
Wow.
Yeah, spread out.
Wow, and your first child was a girl or boy?
Yeah, I had a son. My
Okay.
first child was a son, and then I had two girls.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, can you give an example of when, you were in a professional moment, um, and then you remembered, your own, like, little girl or within you, and or a parenting moment, and how those tied over to allow you to provide a safe place for someone else to be vulnerable,
Mm, right, right. Again, I
because we
think,
do that as parents.
yeah, 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 right. Um, I mean, I think for me, something that's been so pivotal is becoming a more spiritual person, getting access to language, to concepts, and to different mindset.
Mhm.
This whole idea of and recognizing that the mind and body are connected and all that kind of stuff was just foreign to me. I mean, I definitely grew up with the more, and more academic approach to understanding life, which was, the old sciences um, and a lot of probably religious beliefs. And it's so much more helpful to me to be able to talk about things like spirit and soul and all of that, and to be able to be a fully human person and be imperfect,
Mhm.
versus trying to present myself as like, oh, here I am. I'm like this psychologist. I figured everything out, and I'm going to sit here and tell you how you can live your life. I prefer when someone brings something up to share, like, oh, yes. Like I've told many of in the past when I worked with teenagers, that I had an eating disorder. I think it just puts them at ease to think, okay, I'm pretty sure she's not going to judge me. you know,
Okay.
she didn't have like this perfect teenage experience. I
Mhm.
mean, she had a diagnosis, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So
Right.
for me that, and I think when I work with parents, I tell parents all the time, like, of course I've yelled at my kids. Of course I've made mistakes. Of course my children have been angry at me and confronted me with things that I probably shouldn't have done. That isn't the problem. The problem is that, kids want to do that, and they come up against a parent who feels disrespected or
Right.
unappreciated. And so I'm always using examples of my own um, past experiences, whether it's a hurt or a mistake, in the service of trying to make other people feel more comfortable
Mhm.
and feel less shame.
So what do you think then is the biggest obstacle, um, from, uh, just somebody who's out there and is considering, getting help for something, um, who hasn't yet even reached out? Um, what do you think, or what have you experienced as the biggest obstacle to kind of convincing, for lack of a better word, somebody to reach out for help?
And get help.
Then what has been the biggest obstacle once they're, like, in front of you?
hmm I think this is a really good question. And I think that maybe one approach to, if you haven't reached out for help, maybe what you do is you start by, when you do reach out for help, you tell the person that it's very hard. I have thought about reaching out. Start by disclosing that and see how the person responds to you.
That
And
you relate to how hard it is.
before you even get into like what your shame issues are, or what
Mhm.
that you share that with the person, to kind of protect yourself a little bit, because if the person goes like, well, what do you mean, to gauge how warm and open the person is. Because I think
Ex Right.
if you have shame issues, you can't have the typically trained or the traditionally trained person. You need somebody. I mean, I remember reading that a long time ago too. Like the best people to help someone with alcoholism is a recovered,
Right, that's the
alcoholic.
program, yeah.
Because I mean, I'm just saying, if you're you need to find. So I would say to someone who hasn't reached out yet, or has wanted to but is anxious, has a lot of fear, that they just start with that, and they go and they say like, so I thought I would tell you that this is really hard for me. I'm really nervous. I don't know where to begin. I'm a little overwhelmed or afraid. Start with that, because it's true and it's honest, and it's not going to make you quite as vulnerable as getting into something more difficult, and it'll give you a way to gauge the person. Because if the person
Right.
goes like, "Well, I don't understand," or "Tell me more," or if they don't provide the right kind of comfort, because you really need to like, the most important thing is that find somebody that feels a good, like a good match to you.
Hmm.
And what does that look like? I don't know. Like, my kids, when I've encouraged them to all explore therapy, I would say to them, go see two or three people and then see how it feels, because there's not a right or wrong person out there, but it's just how it feels. And so I think, starting with that,
Hmm.
because if you can start right away and say, this is hard for me, or it's taken me a long time to do this, and the person can help you feel comfortable about that and put you at ease, that's going to open the door to
That was your experience also, that there may be an awkward or a bad experience with the first one, like you had, you reached out to, but that
right,
doesn't mean that they all are like that, or that, you
right.
know.
That's right. That's right. And something in me knew that. I think maybe because when I had written to that organization, they said, try. I think they gave me a list of like four or five people, and they said, here are some people. They weren't really vouching for any of them, and
Mhm.
so I think I was kind of encouraged. Reach out to all of them. Reach out to them. I mean, one was a psychiatrist, one was a therapist, one was this graduate student nutritionist, and in the end, I think I reached out to three of the five of them, and the irony was, the first appointment was, I thought, oh, I'll go for the psychiatrist, like the most
Uh,
educated, but and that was the least helpful.
oh, interesting.
You know,
Yeah, so that might happen, but
yeah.
keep following, I know for me, it was the same kind of process, but that voice of truth and soul was still there and nudging, and responding to that, and then trying again and reaching out more. Um, anyone out there that has had bad experiences with getting a therapist or psychiatrist, psychologist, uh,
Hmm.
you know, there's a reason that instinct came in, and just keep trying and you'll find the right one. Now,
And
when
also,
somebody is in your office,
mm,
this is a loaded question, but like, what do you think is the biggest, impediment? And it relates to that feeling of safety, right? That connection to be vulnerable. And what do you think is like the most important thing that we could say to those that have reached out and that are beginning their process of therapy, to are with somebody they feel comfortable with, hopefully, and just kind of starting to kind of dive in and break open?
yeah, I think I mean, I something I will say to people too is like, we're human too. I mean, no one, you're not there's no one that has it all figured out. And so I think what I try to do is model that you can still be a human and be imperfect and be really good at your job. You know what I mean? Or you can
Mhm.
you can still be a human being and imperfect, admit that you're making mistakes, and still be a really good parent.
Right.
It's getting away from sort of black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking, or good or bad thinking. Um, I very early on in my career, I got exposed to dialectical behavior therapy, which was huge for me, because that's when I first learned like the mindfulness component,
Mhm.
and it changed everything for me, because it was the dialectic is this idea that, of course, you could you could be a very happy child with everything you ever needed, and loving parents and all kinds of privilege, and be miserable. That's
Exactly,
so
and our mind will
freeing.
think in these polarities, and this is a survivalist mind. It's thinks it's helping us to survive, but it'll exactly say, "You shouldn't feel this way
Right.
because
So
it's only this way," but you can absolutely be grateful and miserable at the same time.
right. And that was like mind blowing. That was just mind blowing for me. It was similar to getting to college and being like, wait a minute, you shoplifted and you're telling people you did
Mhm.
that? That was just like mind boggling. Like if you do anything bad, you keep that secret. Don't ever
Mhm.
tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And so the dialectic was like another big, huge thing. And that was, my first year in a clinical
That's
practicum.
great. Then that's a quick way to transform shame-based thoughts into power. Is
Right.
this feeling is okay.
Right.
If I'm feeling shame or I'm feeling guilty, or if it's
Mhm.
something more layered, like what we were talking about,
Right.
like, okay, I recognize it. I'm also really proud I just reached out for help,
Mhm.
that I just went to therapy. I didn't, share about whatever, some
Mhm.
argument that happened in the morning in this therapy session or something, but
Mhm.
and I'm ashamed, but I went just to kind
Right.
of
And again, I think for people to know that you're not obligated to open up and share everything right away. It's not even always appropriate. Like I said, I would suggest somebody start with something, like just start with how you feel about going to a first appointment. You don't have to get into things. You don't have to make yourself that vulnerable. I mean,
Mhm.
a therapist needs to earn your trust. They need to earn your trust. And they do that by, you know, how they respond, even if they're nonverbal, by their capacity to make
Interesting.
you feel comfortable, even when you're um, getting into like really difficult material. So I know for me, like there've been times when someone will look really sad and they're not saying that, and I'll say to them, you look you just something changed and you look kind of sad right now, and they'll be like, no, I'm okay, I'm all right, and I'll say, all right, I'm feeling kind of sad myself because I it does feel, and when I say that, like, well, I'm kind of feeling sad because you look kind of sad, they'll often
Okay.
start crying.
So again, it's that human connection.
They'll
That
often start
you know,
crying,
safe.
and right, because they're reluctant to say that they're feeling sad, and so I'll just say, because something in me I will
You will
feel
feel sad, that's
sad,
empathic.
and but I'll just use myself and say, well, gosh, now I'm just feeling kind of sad because I
What
just
is this? Yeah.
perception I had was that you are sad, and then they kind of let go.
Okay.
So it's that takes time, though. That takes time. So
To
I would
deal
also
with
say
that.
to anyone who hasn't like, it can be bumpy and awkward, and you kind of, it's okay. It's okay. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be, you know, smooth sailing. You do want to, though, feel like you can ask questions and stuff. You don't want to ever feel intimidated.
Okay, that's really important.
Hmm.
So, what is another one of those? Like, that you don't want to
You don't
that
want to
someone
feel
shouldn't be belittled, shouldn't be
right, right. You don't want to ever feel. You don't want to ever have to feel like, by intimidated, I mean like you don't want to leave, and if something didn't sit
Oh, I
well,
see.
like I tell people all the time, like if something doesn't land well with you, like just come back and tell me the next time. Like, so you want someone who's inviting
Okay.
feedback, and sometimes you'll see that in somebody's policies, or you'll see it in the description. Now that everybody's online,
Mhm.
you can find a therapist who will say, I'm interactive, or I'm relational. Those are kind of
Okay.
cues that this person's going to kind of like working with you and going to be trying
Oh,
to,
you mean a questionnaire to the client or that you will describe yourself?
like in their policies, sometimes in
Okay.
written policies, or in the description of how they operate, what kind of a approach they take. Um,
Okay. And you're
that
practicing today, a lot? I mean, I know we talked about how you began with kids, and then you did teens, so kids in schools, and then teens, and then after that, you started working with adults, or do you still focus
I
in the
still no.
area
Then
of
I got into adults because I really realized that, um, as a parent and as my own children were getting older, I could be more effective helping the parents of these kids.
okay.
That there was a real need um, for people that could coach parents that have highly sensitive children, because
Mhm.
those they often get a very behavioral. They'll get someone telling them to do very behavioral things, like you need to set limits and there need to be consequences and all of that kind of thing, that it just doesn't work.
Okay,
It doesn't
that's
work.
super important. So there's these behaviors and there's these consequences. Now separate or or versus that, what is the way to go? Is it exactly what we were talking about that helped you? So
So the way
see
to,
them.
right, the way to go is to, yes, to see them. So, for example, you have a child and they're the teacher reaches out and says they're not turning in their homework or something.
Mhm.
Instead of like sitting them down and saying, listen, I'm going to start checking your homework now every night. And if there's one more time that you don't get that, just you're not doing your homework, you're not going to get television anymore. We're going to start taking things away. Even a very loving parent with good intentions might do that, set that all up. That doesn't help the child, because the child's getting the message, homework's really important and I'm going to be in trouble and I'm going to lose things if I don't. But you need to understand what's going on.
Okay.
You need to look and see what the issue is, and you need to have a conversation with your child as if they're the expert on themselves, not you. And you
Okay.
say to them, so your teachers let me know, and now I'm aware of you're having something trouble with your homework. um, can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, what about that is hard for you? What's going on with your homework? And often a kid will say, I don't know, I don't know. And so then your job becomes to kind of offer them a menu. Like, when you go to a restaurant, here's the options you have. And you say to the kid, well, does it feel like it's too hard for you? Do you feel like it's you're trying to do it at the wrong time of the day? Are you having trouble understanding certain things? Are you angry with your teacher? As a child, I mean, and then let the child, because then the child can say, really? You know about that?
Okay.
They can say, like, oh, yeah, angry with the teacher? That's
So
an
it's
option. Yeah, I'll
helping
take that.
them find the language to put the scenario out there and then, get to the feelings, get to the
It's the
underlying layers.
opposite of shaming them.
Okay.
It's the opposite of shaming them. It's instead of saying to them, well, this is pretty rotten.
And the behavior, "You shouldn't do that. Stop. You're gonna be punished for it."
Right. That whole, I even grew up with the generation of parents, or certainly my grandmother. My grandmother would frequently say, "You should be ashamed of yourself." She would just tell you that, like, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Mhm.
You should feel really bad about that. And again, it was meant to instill morals and values and that kind of thing. But if you're a sensitive kid, I was like, oh, I felt very ashamed. So the alternative is
Okay.
guidance, direction, problem solving, working with them. I really do. I did this training with on they used to call them highly explosive children. Now they're considered more highly sensitive children. And I did this training with Ross Green and Stuart Ablum. It was so resonated with me. Like, they're doing the best they can.
Mhm.
And this is also Marsha Linehan in dialectical behavior therapy. She'll say everybody is doing the best they can. They can do better, of course, but this is the best on any given day. This is the best. You're always going to see the best. So
Mhm.
someone who's floundering or actually problematic, that's the best they can come up with. So you need to look at that and work with that. And
Choose
you need to wonder.
love.
Yeah, you
See,
need to choose
choose love that
curiosity.
anything anybody does is either an act of love or a cry for love, and whatever you're observing, they're doing either in one way, but getting in that place
Yes,
of sitting back and also not taking it personally. And
right,
then you'll see, okay, if I'm in the fear and judgment, then they'll do what you explained. It'll be the label. It'll
right,
be the no, 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 and there's just more pushback because
right.
they don't feel seen.
Yeah, I like to coach people and say, then as soon as you realize you're having a critical thought,
Mhm.
make this shift from critical to curious. Like,
That's
you know,
my oldest son, Diego. His podcast just released the first interview, and he says diving into that innate curiosity in each of us is the first, he believes, starting point on a
Yeah.
healing journey.
Right.
And then he talked about applying the scientific method to life things. And you're saying, so a dialectical behavioral thought and work,
Yeah.
you're saying get curious about the thought.
Right. Get curious. Get curious about the thought. Get curious about the behavior. Get curious about the emotion. Like, okay, where is this coming from? Like curious about the homework. Like, what's happening to your homework? Like, what's going on? And we all know when someone's genuinely curious and when someone is being critical. We all know that. So,
Right.
when you embrace and you interact with others with a more loving, open-minded, curious stance, you can make big changes.
And just saying, I can see that you're really upset.
Well, and it's just going back
And
to, like, what's your assumption? I mean, why are we so quick to assume that what people are doing is
is right or
intended
wrong?
for
Mm.
malice or something? I mean,
Yes. That's our mind in separating us in fear and judgment. And why is that? You're right.
yeah. So, well, I mean, it's just our negativity bias that, people
Yes,
talk about, that, we're on high alert for problems because the sooner we identify a problem, the better our chances are of averting some sort of danger. And it doesn't
true.
serve us well because we don't live in such a
Or
dangerous
holding
environment.
ourselves accountable. 'Cause it's
Right,
all the outside blame.
right, right.
So get curious about your own thought and get curious about the behavior of another's that another's thoughts is creating.
Right,
And
right.
yes, that's beautiful.
Hmm.
I'm gonna give, an example, and I've been working hard over the last couple of years, with my little ones, and, um, I mean, just it's just so beautiful, the more consistent and the longer time that passes, and, the other day, one of my little ones did something, and it broke something, and we were scuttling, kind of trying to get our way to school to be on time. And so I was navigating that, and he ended up, um, running to me with something in his hand that was broken, that he broke, and just was like, fell into my arms and just felt safe. Felt like he didn't have to hide it. He knew mommy wasn't gonna, focus on that, on the thing. And it was just like, I just put my hand on his back, and it was just like, he wasn't taking it out on himself, what he was feeling, his guilt and shame or
Hmm.
whatever it was in the moment, anger, nor was he taking it out on anybody else. It was just this perfect moment of acknowledging his response to whatever upset him that made him do that, and accepting in that part of vulnerability what he actually did. And it just was total acceptance, that place of vulnerability, and not all those other added layers of labels, punishment, whatever it was. And it was beautiful. It was just beautiful because then we can dive into the other things, of teaching how he's responding to his feelings and how it affects the behavior, like,
Hmm.
which we have been for a couple of years. And having him do that was like exactly what we want to do as adults,
Hmm.
exactly what we want to do
Right,
in relationships.
right, right. Makes me think of the work of Kristen Neff and uh, uh, Chris Germer, and it's just about the
Mm.
power of compassion and self compassion. That, when we say, for example, as an adult, if you drop something and it breaks, what's the first thing we tend to do? I'm so stupid.
Yes,
I'm so stupid, or oh my God, that cost a lot of money, or oh, I'm gonna have to clean this up. This is where we go. We
Or
go
I'm
through
gonna get
some,
in trouble. They're gonna say you're so clumsy.
someone's
Or
gonna, or so and so's gonna be mad at me or something. That's it. Rather than, what if we could train ourselves so the minute you drop something, you could say like, this is a difficult moment. This is a moment of, wow, this is a moment of suffering. This is really difficult. Just take a deep breath. It's not being, sugarcoating anything. It's like, yeah, okay, this item just broke. This is a mess. This is a moment of difficulty. This is a moment of small suffering.
right,
Then you move from there. But how this is why we're all exhausted and stressed out, because all this self-talk and our immediate reaction to ourselves is so shame inducing.
right. But when we have that home, or that whatever you want to call your space in the middle between the awareness of the thoughts and then your soul, truth speaking, it gets less exhausting to navigate being a spirit in a body with a mind that's nonstop.
Yes, and I think the thing to say about that is that you have to cultivate that connection to that home within. I mean, I meditate every day. I think you need to have a steady um, stream of the right content coming your way, because the alternative is to live in the culture where the media set the agenda, and it's just movies and billboards and magazine advertisements and radio announcements and competitions and everything. If you don't have something countering that, you'll go back to an old mindset. So I listen to podcasts. I'm always reading the new books about mindfulness, spirituality, things like that. You have to do that. And then you have to take some time. It can be 5 minutes a day. You don't have to meditate. You have to close your eyes and you have to pay attention to what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your body. How does it feel in your body? How does it feel? What is going on in your mind? What are you thinking? What are you worried about? What are you ruminating about? What are you wanting? What are you yearning for? So those, it's like your physical health. You have to give a little time and attention to it if you want to improve the quality.
Right. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so, so much. I do hope that this is one of several different conversations with you. I really appreciate your openness, and I really appreciate all the wisdom that you shared. So
Yeah.
thank you so
Well, thank
much.
you. Thank you. This important work you're doing. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Of a flame that never dies.
You are not alone. If you are dealing with shame and trauma, please reach out to me through my website, nadia-davis.com. You can get a free band shame tip sheet and find out about upcoming events. I'd love it if you picked up my book, Home is Within You, wherever books are sold. If you like this podcast, please tell a friend, leave a review, and make sure to follow me on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Sending warm hugs.